Sarah is the author of Book of Ore. It's a national bestseller. It's the on the David Suzuki Foundation Book Club pick list. Won gold at the Canadian Culinary Book Awards. She's a food columnist for CBC Radio, Here and Now. And she has a new book on the future of food, and it will be published next year. So please welcome Sarah Elton.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Thank you. I'm really happy to be here. I've heard so much about all the great things that are happening in Burlington, and I just got to see your community garden. I was so envious. Where I live, there's a dearth of community gardens, and none that look as beautiful and nice and new as that one. One of the first questions that people always ask me is, how did you get started writing about food and sustainability? And I've told this story many times, and I opened the book with it, and I'm going to tell it again today because it really was a major turning point in my life. Everything I do today that has to do with food can be traced back to the day when my daughter came home from a birthday party with a loot bag. In her loot bag, there was a cookie. And she took it out. She wanted to eat it. And it looked like it was made in a neighborhood bakery. It was shaped like a pig. It had pink icing. It was a gingerbread style cookie. But it was shrink wrapped. So I flipped it over, and on the back was a label, and it said, "Made in China." Now, I knew my clothes were made in China, and half the things in my house were made in China. But there was something about seeing that this piece of food in my daughter's loot bag was made on the other side of the world and transported here that really highlighted for me the environmental cost of our food system. And the environmental cost of this industrial food system that feeds us today, it is huge. I could spend the next few hours, and don't worry, I won't, describing the horrors of industrial food, because they really are horrors. But I'm going to keep that brief and try to focus on the good news, not just the bad. So here's the bad news in broad brush strokes. And this is what's really got me motivated to talk about the good news. So over the last 50 years, demand for water has tripled. And how do we use our water? We use it to cook, we use it to bathe. No, mostly we use it to produce our food. Agriculture, this I find, every time I cite this statistic, I find it shocking. Agriculture represents 70% of global water use. That's more than industry. Industry is only 22%. So what this means is that the United Nations estimates that groundwater reserves around the world are being used faster than they can be replenished. And not only are we using up groundwater reserves, but we're also polluting our water resources. We're polluting them with the chemical fertilizers and pesticides that we need to grow our food in the monocultures of the industrial food system. So we are squandering our planet's water. We're also squandering our land, the soil that we need to grow our food. We're running out of that too. I'm sure every single one of you in this room has witnessed this. The main cause that's causing the evaporation of land, urban sprawl. Cities around the world are growing, and we're building houses where there used to be farmland. We're building factory, we're building industries, all in the places where our food used to grow. By 2020, the projected arable land per capita will be less than half what it was in 1950. And that's exactly why investors and hedge funds and governments of land-poor countries are rushing to buy up farmland in countries in Africa as well as in South America and Asia. They're rushing to buy up this land because land is scarce. And it's also happening here in Canada in the prairies. So we're using too much water, we're losing our agricultural lands, and we're destroying the environment. And at the same time, our population is growing. Today, there are 7 billion of us. We passed 7 billion at Halloween. By 2020, you can add another about 500 million more. Now add climate change to this scenario, which of course the industrial food system contributes to as well. So according to the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, the livestock industry alone represents 18% of humanity's greenhouse gas emissions. And food as a whole represents 30% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And that's because the industrial food system that brings us our strawberries and our lettuce at the supermarket and much more, this is a fossil fuel-based food system. And we're using ancient solar energy that's been stored in the earth for millennia, and we're using this to fertilize our fields, to power our irrigation systems, to refrigerate our food, and so that we can transport it around the world. So those were the broad strokes. Unfortunately, the details are even more depressing, and I'm not even going to go there tonight. But obviously, as a species, we have a really big problem. And the problem in a nutshell is, how can we feed a growing world population when our agricultural systems are constrained by both climate change and environmental degradation? But there is good news, and that is innovation. And that's the innovation of this global sustainable food movement that is working right now to solve these problems. And they're working to mitigate climate change all around the world, and in Canada too, across the country. So people are proving that innovation and creative problem solving can help to guide us as we build more resilient food systems everywhere. I want to define innovation because these days we often think of innovation to mean technology, like our smartphones. And when it comes to food, we think of technology of the industrial food system as innovation. But in fact, when I talk about food and sustainability, people often come up to me afterwards, after the talk, and say, yes, Sarah, I understand sustainability. It's all good, but don't we need all that innovation, all that of the industrial food system, all that technology, all those machines, all that capital? Don't we need that to feed the world? The answer is simple. Yes, we do need innovation and technology, but then let's redefine what counts as innovation. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, has 4 categories of innovation. So that's product, process, marketing, and organization. And if we look to the sustainable food movements all around the world and here in Canada, we see all sorts of innovations that fit into these categories, yet that don't require lots of money. And nevertheless, even without lots of money, at the grassroots, people are solving these serious problems brought to us by industrial food. We are actually a very creative and resourceful species. And I really want to stress that supporting sustainable food does not mean rejecting technology. It does not mean that we all have to go back to subsistence farming. It does not mean we have to go back to the olden days, to pre-industrial revolution. The problems that we're facing in the future really are so grave that we have to consider all the options, and that means everything's on the table, but it doesn't mean going backwards in time. So new technologies should be pursued in tandem with these innovative ideas that are fueled by creativity, rather than just lots of capital, such as the ones I'm going to tell you about right now. So I've chosen to focus on 3 stories of innovation in Canada. And there's so many more. I was trying to figure out what am I going to talk about? But I will highlight innovations in better growing methods, innovations in the marketplace, and innovations in waste reduction. And these are stories of real people across the country doing small things, and some people doing big things, but all these things are having a really large impact. So innovation in better growing methods. When I talk about innovation in better growing methods, I mean, how do we reduce the environmental impact of how we grow our food? So how do we recalibrate the way we grow our food so that farming doesn't, take from nature so much without giving back? How do we do this? How do we improve? Well, there's a new term that's being used a lot to describe sustainable agriculture, and it's called sustainable intensification. And this means, how do we figure out how to grow more food on the land that we already farm while having, at the very least, a neutral impact on the environment? And this is the idea that we don't want to expand our farming. We certainly don't want to cut any more trees down to make room for more fields, because we need those forests to act as carbon sinks for climate change. So instead, we have to figure out how to grow as much food as we can sustainably on the land that we have. So farmers are doing things that make the best use of these practices. What does it look like in Canada? in Norfolk County in Ontario, so not too far that away from here, a couple hours. There's something called the ALICE program, and that stands for Alternative Land Use Services. And it encourages farmers to become stewards, environmental stewards of their land, and make that part of their business. So the program encourages farmers to do things like plant hedgerows with native species and flowers to create habitats for pollinators. And they pay farmers about $150 an acre to reforest land and rehabilitate wetlands. One farmer I've written about in my new book, his name is Brian Gilvesi. And Brian is a real character. He really is one of the most enthusiastic people I've ever met. You know, a tour of his farm, someone's nodding. If you've met Brian, he's like, oh, he's a tornado of excitement. And he's so excited about what he's doing on his farm. And he and his wife, Kathy, they own a farm. It's called YU Ranch. And they raise Texas Longhorn cattle for beef. And he really is evangelical about how farmers can not only reduce their environmental impact of farming, but also take on this role of environmental protector. On his farm, he used to grow tobacco. Big switch. Now he has seeded 70 acres of marginal lands with tall grass, prairie flowers, and plants. So for all the gardeners out there, the fields are gorgeous, and you'd recognize the flowers like echinacea, lanceleaf coreopsis, brown-eyed Susans, and that's where the cows graze. So it's just a beautiful setting. And he's also planted, amid the flowers are also perennial grasses. And the fields, when they're planted this way, they act as a wildlife habitat. So for the pollinators and the birds, he's on a committee to help save the bobolink. And they also provide this grazing land for the cattle. And then for the winter, he hays these fields as well, and he saves the hay in his barn rather than feeding them corn. Brian also calls these plants his insurance policy against hot summers that we're getting because of climate change, because the roots of all these native grasses and flowers are so deep that even in a drought, they're able to grow deep, deep into the earth and last through dry conditions, which I'm sure he will need this summer unless something seriously changes this spring. And Brian raises cattle on this land, and he sells his beef a lot to local chefs, but also to people. He does direct marketing, sells directly to the customer. And in this way, he's able to support his family and help steward the environment where he lives. So I love Brian's story because it's an example of how farming can really integrate ecology and agriculture, something that we really need a lot more of. And when we're thinking about finding these solutions to these big problems, and that's why I wanted to talk about them in large brush strokes, because they're big problems and they're overwhelming. And you know, when you think of how big the problem is, you can feel defeated. But it's important to remember that the small farms, the small people, or the regular people like us, these small farms, they're the places where so many of these new and innovative ideas are actually born. There's a professor in the School of Economics at the University of Maine. Her name is Linda Silka, and she's found in her research that most innovation actually occurs on small farms. So on small farms, people are more able to experiment with new crops, with new growing methods, and then these ideas, they incubate, they spread out to the mainstream. So the small farms are the laboratories for the rest of agriculture. Innovation number 2. The innovation of new consumer and farmer relations in the marketplace, basically, how we buy and sell our food. So the local food movement's push away from industrial food has focused really on shortening the food chain, you know, narrowing that distance between the person who grows the food and the person who eats the food. And specifically, they've really worked on making the connections between the farmers and the consumers. The most obvious example of this in Canada has been the rise of the farmers market. How many farmers markets are there in your community now? There's so many more where I live. According to research out of the University of Saskatchewan, in the 1970s, there were only 16 farmers markets in Alberta. They didn't keep national statistics, too bad. Today, there are dozens in Alberta, hundreds across the country, with sales, and this is according to the national organization Farmers Markets Canada, with sales totaling over $1 billion across the country. Of course, Canada has a really long history of farmers markets. Our first farmers market was founded in Halifax, and the St. Lawrence Market in Toronto, that was founded before the War of 1812. But we strayed away from this direct contact between the consumer and the grower in the 20th century, and that was because of the rise of the greengrocer first, and then later the supermarket, and now we're rediscovering this connection, this farmers market. But we're also reinventing the farmers market. The farmers market today doesn't look anything like it did 150 years ago. There was a museum photos of the St. Lawrence Market in Toronto that showed what the market looked like in the 1800s, and there was bear and all sorts of wild game and incredible scenes that it was even hard to believe that that's the same place where I buy my vegetables today. It's changed so dramatically, understandably, in 150 years. But this idea, this way of selling food directly to the consumer, why it works is that the farmer retains the profit. It works because it allows mostly these small-scale farmers, often sustainable farmers, not always, but it offers these small farmers the opportunity to make a living that they couldn't otherwise make if they were selling to a middleman or if they were selling to the supermarket. And this idea, this economic model, this connection between consumer and producer is spreading around the world. While I was researching my new book about the future of food, I traveled around the world and I found that people in many countries were actually looking to Canada, looking to the United States and seeing our farmers markets here and wanting to replicate them elsewhere. I interviewed people in the Middle East, in Europe, and the Indian subcontinent in Asia who are creating farmers markets like ours. And I was surprised because I thought, just a second, you assume, isn't this how most people buy and sell their food who aren't operating who don't go to the supermarket? But no, these are new relationships too, because let's say the traditional Middle Eastern souk or the Indian bazaar, these are places where merchants come with the farmer's produce. So even in the developing world, where they are also seeking to replicate this closer connection between the farmer and the consumer so that small-scale farmers everywhere can survive and make a living and continue to live in our rural communities. The third innovation I want to talk about is the innovation of waste reduction. When we talk about food, we often forget to talk about waste, and that not just what you leave on your plate afterwards, but all the waste along the food chain. And I'm guilty of this myself. It's easy to talk about, it's easy to forget about the waste. But a really important part of the answer to the question of how we can feed the world can be found by reducing the amount of food that we waste. In Canada, also in the United States, we waste about 40% of the food that is produced. So, I've been guilty of throwing out black and droopy basil, stale bread. I just threw out a quarter of a loaf the other day, and it was moldy, so I couldn't even turn it into bread pudding or anything, or French toast. But this is really a much bigger problem than us as the individual consumers, because food is wasted in the farmer's field when things aren't picked because they don't look like that someone will buy them. They're not aesthetically pretty enough. Food is wasted at the processor. When a meatball isn't perfectly round, say, at the processing. It's wasted at the supermarket. Supermarkets throw out tons of food. You can, if anybody knows any dumpster divers, any dumpster diver will tell you the people who hang out at the, and they're often prevented from doing it, but hang out in the parking lots of supermarkets and going into the dumpsters to see all sorts of food that gets thrown out. They'll tell you all the great stuff that just gets chucked because it doesn't look saleable. Also in restaurants, and as well as also at home. And when it comes to air-freighted foods, the waste levels for fresh fruits and vegetables that are flown in, this is estimated to be about 40%. And interestingly enough, this problem exists in other parts of the world too. It's not just a North American problem, which I guessed that earlier. I thought it's got to be just us here in North America. Other people can't waste food as much as we do. No, they do. Everybody is wasteful. And according to the US Department of Agriculture, if we were to recover 5% of all the food that is wasted, we could feed 4 million more people a day with just that food. If you up that number to 25% of the food we waste, we could feed 20 million more people. But this is an area where innovation has also played a huge role. There's an organization in Toronto called Second Harvest, and they do something called food rescue. And that is they take donations from these factories where the meatballs are not perfect, from importers, from supermarkets. And these are donations of food that would have otherwise been thrown out. And they take this food and they give it to social service agencies to feed hungry people. Last year, they rescued 6.8 million pounds of food in Toronto. This is also happening in the United States. There are organizations like this in the United Kingdom, in Denmark, in South Africa, in Italy, in Japan. And it's an example of how people have taken a very complicated problem, because there are many, many reasons why we throw out 40% of the food we produce. We're not just selfish and horrible people. It's a really complicated problem, but for this complicated problem, they found such a simple solution. An example of Second Harvest's creativity is this new program they have where they give rescued food to agencies that are offering culinary courses to people who are needing new skills. They teach them how to cook the food. They cook the food, this rescued food, and then that food is given to other agencies who are feeding hungry people but don't have kitchens where they can prepare food from scratch. Like, wow, beautiful. That's one of the beautiful things about food. You know, take food and you can solve any problem. And it's this kind of grassroots and civil society food innovation and where Canada really is a world leader. There are countless examples of success in Canada. And these ideas are being spread to other countries. And this is really what keeps me optimistic about the future, despite those horrible environmental facts that I described at the beginning. You know, there really are millions of people every day who are working on these problems, who are dreaming up all these new ideas, who are innovating in their own communities. And I really do believe that one day we will reach a tipping point where this will ripple out and we all will have access to sustainable food. To conclude, I wanted to tell you a story of one of the communities that I write about in Locavore. It's a community in New Brunswick that has reached this tipping point. The town of Dieppe is a small town north of the city of Moncton. And, it's south of the city of Moncton. The farmers are north of Moncton. It's a typical suburban-looking community in Canada. You go downtown Dieppe, and there are the big box supermarkets, big box stores, and it's just a typical town. So the farmers who are north of Moncton and near an area called Acadie-Ville, they have been growing Brussels sprouts for decades. They had been growing Brussels sprouts for freezing. And one day the factory that bought their Brussels sprouts to freeze and to ship them away decided that they could get Brussels sprouts cheaper from another part of the world. So they just stopped buying from the farmers. Well, 600 acres of Brussels sprouts is really hard to move. So they started trying to grow other vegetables, but they couldn't sell them. The supermarket said they could get cauliflower and broccoli, et cetera, they're getting it from California and from Mexico, so they had nowhere to sell their food. So these farmers were in crisis. They didn't know what to do. People were losing their farms. And they got together one night, a group of farmers, and they said, okay, I have an idea. Why don't we'll set up a network of farm stands. So I'll sell her carrots, she'll sell my potatoes, I'll sell his tomatoes, and I'll sell her broccoli. Well, the people in their community, they loved it. They started shopping at those farm stands. Then this town of Dieppe that looks like anywhere in Canada, North America, they heard about what these farmers were doing. They'd created this, it's called the Really Local Food Co-op. And they said, well, why don't you come and sell at a farmer's market? Let's create a farmer's market with you. So they started this farmer's market. And the farmers wanted to distinguish themselves from all the other food that people could get at the supermarket. So what made their food different? They said, okay, let's grow sustainable food. Let's prove to people that we're different. So they created an ecological growing standard, set of ecological growing standards. So they tested their water for E. coli, and they reduced their pesticide usage by practicing integrated pest management. And then they gave themselves the écologique stamp. They opened the farmers market down the street from these big box supermarkets. On the first day of market, 10,000 people showed up to buy their food. And ever since, that was years ago now, ever since, every weekend, thousands of people come to buy their local sustainable food from their local farmers. That just shows, you know, wherever you go in Canada, if people are given a choice, that's the kind of food they want to eat. Wherever you go in Canada, people are coming up with these innovative ideas that really can solve our big problems, but at the micro level, at the level that affect what we eat every single day. Thank you.